Welcome to the Grow Podcast. I'm Pastor Mike with New Hope Network. We're here to help you take your next step in your relationship with Jesus. I'm so glad you're with us today.
What's up, New Hope family? Welcome to the Grow Podcast. My name is David. This is episode 91. So glad that you're here with us. With me, as always, is Pastor Mike. Hello, Pastor Mike.
Oh, David.
91 episodes.
No, we're nearing a century worth of episodes.
We're getting there. We
talked. Listen to one a year. It'd be a century. Do the math.
Thanks, Pastor Mike.
That
was
working
really good
on that one for a while.
Yeah, I think that's what when we talk about next steps. Just take one next step a year, and right? Isn't that what you?
Yeah, not a bad idea.
I mean, you should take one next step a year. Yeah. That's okay. Probably take a few more during that year as well. No? Yes? No?
That's a discussion for another time.
Interesting. That'll be episode 92. We'll get to that one. We have battling sugar-free beverages here.
Yeah.
I've kind of been on a Diet Coke kick as of late.
I'm sorry.
Tastes like my childhood because it's all my dad ever had. Oh. So like we'd go to a Twins game and he'd have his fanny pack full of granola bars and peanuts from home because he didn't want to pay the ballpark prices. Sorry for outing you there, Father. And at the Metrodome, you couldn't bring outside food in. I think at Target Field where they play now, you can bring stuff in, but you couldn't at the Metrodome. So he'd wear his fanny pack.
He snuck it in.
And
wow,
he brought so much stuff in that fanny pack. No, my former pastor.
Oh, your former
pastor. I was talking, a couple of my basketball players were actually here at church the other week, and I was talking to him afterwards, and one of my managers was here as well, and she was wearing a fanny pack, but how they wear them now, like,
oh yeah, the crossbody.
Yeah, and like it's not a fanny pack. Then it's just a weird purse.
If I use that term fanny pack, my kids will roll their eyes at me because it's an out of date phrase. So you're aging yourself.
Well, my players were saying like they were going to get one, and I was like, oh my word. So then I had to tell the story of my dad and his fanny pack back in the day. I don't think anybody thought he was cool in his fanny pack, but I didn't care. That was my source of snacks.
Food in there.
So we'd go. He'd buy one large Diet Coke that we would share, and then we'd snack on the stuff he brought from home and watch the Twins be terrible in the 90s. It was pretty great.
By the way, if you're joining us, this is the way every Grow podcast starts out as we talk nonsense.
Fanny pack
we had a
conversations.
Comment here. A new listener started listening a few weeks ago, and they're like, all they talked about was... And
so they turned it off 3 minutes in.
Pastor Kylie had to step on and say, yeah, there's always some nonsense at the beginning. Just, get past it. And
we just chat for a little bit. Did you go to, how long did you live in Minnesota?
I lived there for 11 years.
You were 11 when you left? Mm-hmm. Did you go to any Twins games while you lived there at Old Met Stadium?
Yep.
My dad would always tell me that you could bring anything into Met Stadium. So they would go, I think it was when he first started pastoring, because I feel like Pastor Zerby, who was his first senior pastor when he was a youth pastor right out of college, and I think it was Pastor Zerby's wife, they would bring a cooler, and she would have made like a multi-course dinner, and they'd eat that at the ballpark together. Like, that sounds incredible.
Yeah. When we lived in Sacramento, the Sacramento River Cats is it AAA ball? AAA ball?
I don't
so
know.
they were, I don't remember what team they're with. I want to say maybe it's Oakland. But it was a small, kind of almost old-fashioned field park. Yeah. We loved it, and for like $1, a couple bucks, you could go sit in the grass.
Oh, that's cool.
Out in the outfield, cool. And you could bring your cooler in. So especially when the boys were little, they could just run. We'd bring a picnic blanket, and that's some of our favorite memories.
Yeah, that's good
being out there for that. Yeah, I grew up going to Twins games and Vikings games in that studio. I would bundle all up,
outdoor football in Minnesota.
Butane mitten warmers. You have no idea what I'm talking about.
That sounds like a terrible idea.
Yeah, it almost looks, it's a little like silver thing that you've put butane lighter fluid in there, and you click, it's like a lighter, you click it, and it's a heat warmer. You put them in your mittens.
I'm sure there were never any terrible accidents.
Growing up in the 70s.
Let us know in the chat if you used butane mitten warmers. That is a nightmare.
It was warm.
Did you? And then when you were done with your butane mitten warmers, did you go play with lawn darts? And
yes. Actually,
what a time to be alive.
I've got lawn dart stories that I should probably know.
Oh man,
a lawn dart just about killed me one time.
A lawn dart just about killed everybody at all times.
Child,
Those are insane.
I went running across as a child as it landed just right next to my body, straight down.
Well,
my dad got rid of them after that.
Yeah, that was probably a good call on his part. I don't know if Jesus ever played with lawn darts. I'm guessing they weren't invented back then.
I'm sure they had other things.
Maybe they were just chucking spears up in the air for fun. Yeah. But we're gonna talk on the weekend. I mean, it feels weird to say you talked about Jesus in your weekend teaching.
We do that every week. Yeah,
but I feel like usually he's a part of the weekend teaching. But some of the things that Jesus said about himself, words he used to describe himself. Again, like we always say, if you missed the weekend teaching, if you missed any of the weekend teachings, always go check them out on either on our website, on the app, on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/New Hope Here. But there's still a lot of questions about Jesus.
Yeah.
We're here a couple years later.
Yeah.
After this was all written,
and people challenged or have misunderstandings or have come to wrong conclusions.
And what was he? Was he just a teacher? Was he just a guy? Did he even claim? That's one of the things we hear a lot of the time too. Is did he? Jesus never claimed to be God, or all these things that Christians just manufactured a lot of those things. So
it's interesting. I mean, because all the information you get on the internet is absolutely 100% accurate.
100% of the time. Yep.
And there will be a lot of people that run across teachings or articles or things from there that's like, oh yeah, that's absolutely true, but they don't bother to check it out themselves.
It's on like Dave's Christian hating blog blogspot.net.
But asking the question, who is Jesus, like we talked about on the weekend, is not a new question.
No, yeah.
In fact, Jesus asked his disciples the same question. When people say, well, Jesus never claimed, he asked his disciples, who do people say I am?
Yeah.
And let them wrestle with it with him right there. And of course, he walked them through that. And Jesus said in John chapter 8, he says, if you do not believe that I'm the one I claim to be, then you will indeed die in your sins. So how we answer the question, who is Jesus, like we talked about this weekend, everything rises and falls on that.
Yeah. So I think we'll spend some time asking some of those questions. We won't spend a lot of time, although I think you're going to touch on it a little bit, on what, like, did Jesus really exist? Because that's not, that at one point was, a more of a point of contention. People would try to say, oh, well, he didn't even exist. It's not really even
there's very few scholars you'll find. In fact, they're kind of on the outskirts, almost considered a little bit of the crazies out there who would say he doesn't exist because the evidence is so strong.
And we're not talking biblical scholars and biblical historians. We're just talking historians because there's so much historical evidence from both Christian sources and non-Christian sources.
There's 39 specific that are just considered solid, and there's others, but solid ancient documents. Over half of them were written by people who didn't claim to be a follower of Jesus, who categorically say Jesus existed. And the other thing that we find in all those is almost everywhere people say not only did he exist, but almost everybody categorically agrees he was a good man. At some level.
Well, and I think that's the first question we'll touch on too. Was Jesus just a good man? So we just quickly covered he existed. Jesus is a historical person who existed. That's not really a question. But was he a good man? Was Jesus just a good man?
Well, and the answer to that is yes, he was a good man. But if you kind of put a period at the end of that,
or the word just in front of it,
he's just a good man, there's a problem because we still have to deal with what he taught. You can't say he was just a good man without having to deal with what he taught because he claimed divine authority.
So that's one that a lot of, I brought that up earlier, but there are people that will say, well, Jesus never claimed to be God. He never claimed to be those things. So how do we know that he claimed to have divine authority?
Well, all we do is look at the Gospels, which are, people will say, well, those aren't historical documents. Yeah, they are. They're historical documents written by eyewitnesses. Matthew was an eyewitness. Luke was a researcher who interviewed eyewitnesses. John was an eyewitness. Mark was a researcher who interviewed probably Peter, who was an eyewitness. And so when you go through just these, you have in Mark chapter 2, Jesus forgave sins. in John chapter 8. In fact, this weekend we looked at 6 of 7 I am statements that Jesus said, and the language in all of those directly connects to like the I am that God used to describe himself in the burning bush. And everybody who heard him 2,000 years ago knew that's what he was referring to. We just don't do that. Mark chapter 14, he directly claimed to be the Messiah. Luke chapter 20, he taught that the Messiah was not simply David's heir, but David's Lord, and he equated himself with it. Matthew chapter 28, he assumed equal authority with God. John chapter 14, I mean, I could go on and on and on here, you know. And finally, John 3:16, John 6, John 7, he invited people to believe in him for salvation. That's divine authority. You can't say he's just good. You've got to deal with the fact he claimed to be divine. And in the history of Israel, I just put this in our notes, no prophet or king, priest or rabbi ever offered salvation in their own name. It would have been blasphemous for them to make that kind of appeal, which is why the religious mess wanted to put him to death, because they heard him make these claims. Claims. But then on top of that, he did stuff that only God could do. I mean, not like David Copperfield or whoever, you know, the most recent magician is, Penn and Teller, whoever it is.
I don't think it's Penn and Teller.
Yeah, whoever it is. I don't know who the most recents are. I'm kind of out of that.
That was my favorite.
Yeah, you like that one?
Who are the most recentest? And you picked someone from the 80s and 90s.
I was trying to come up. Are there like modern?
Yeah, David Blaine's very, very
David
popular.
Blaine, okay, yeah.
And then there was a show.
I would put him in the older group.
There was a show on Netflix called Magic for Humans. Did you see it? No, it's fantastic, and it's he got really, really popular, and then ended up touring, and it's just a lot of like kind of like smaller scale Copperfield-esque things that he does right in front of people, so they're crazy.
So I mean,
there are some modern.
Okay, there are some.
We'll go with Penn and Teller.
I don't know if it was the thing. Yeah, I don't know if that was the thing. You know, so some people kind of relegate it to he just did some unexplainable things.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe, but you know, he raised people from the dead. He healed people. And he healed people who the eyewitnesses say everybody knew that they'd been sick for a long time. So it wasn't just like, oh, there's someone new in the crowd. We don't know him, you know.
Yeah.
A setup in the crowd. He calmed storms. He fed 5,000 people, actually 15,000 people. He cast out demons. He accepted worship. That's a God thing. Or a sociopath, you know, psycho kind of thing, you know. He gave authority to his disciples to do miracles, and they did miracles or accomplished miracles, and he came back from dead himself. That's kind of a God thing there. So, you know, and people want to push that to the side and say, yeah, you know, that's just, none of that's real. But the historical documents record so many of these things. Mm-hmm. And we have more historical documents recording these things than we do for other events that no one questions. Mm-hmm. You know, we've talked about that multiple times. You know, one of the most famous that I talk about is like Hannibal crossing the Alps. We've got like less than 5 historical documents, and nobody goes, not sure that happened.
Yeah, and they weren't contemporary either. Yeah. They were, written centuries later.
And we have all of these, you know, 39 specific, but then hundreds and hundreds of others.
Yeah.
But because we don't want to attribute to Jesus what Jesus attributed to himself, we go, I'm not sure if we can believe those.
I think another issue with just saying, like, okay, Jesus existed and he was just a good man. You can't claim all of those things that he claimed and be a good man if they're not true.
Yeah.
Like if those are all lies, then he's not a good dude.
Yeah. I think it was C.S. Lewis, and I won't get the exact quote, but he said, you know, you can't conclude that he was just a good man or even just a moral teacher and without dealing with the stuff that he said about himself.
Yeah.
Said only he either was who he claimed to be or he was a lunatic, and this is where I will get Lewis's words right, on the level of a person who claims to be a poached egg. You know, that's so C.S. Lewis, you know. You know, he's either who he claimed to be or he's nuts.
There's like a small part of me that wants to meet someone who thinks that they're a poached egg now, but all right, so another question is just, is Jesus's divinity made up?
Yeah.
Is it a myth? Is it just again, like, so this, especially this ties into like the teacher one, and it crosses over a little bit with the things that he claimed that we talked about before. But was that part just made up?
Yeah,
I mean, divinity,
because it's been established he's a historical figure. So it's like, well, did the legends, like the Arthurian legends of King Arthur or Robin Hood, did those things change over time? In fact, there was a Time magazine article in the late 90s. It was based on a book, and I captured the quote for this. Here's what I had put in my notes from that article. He said, while Jesus may have been a carpenter, that probably meant he was illiterate. He did not preach salvation from sin through sacrifice. For that matter, he probably never delivered the Sermon on the Mount, and he never cured any diseases. As for the other miracles, well, no loaves or fishes, no water and wine, no raising of Lazarus, and certainly no resurrection. So what happened to his body? Most likely he was consumed by wild dogs. That was the claim of these people. But the problem with what they claimed, it doesn't pan out with the evidence. That their assumption is actually more mythological than, the actual evidence. It's a stretch to say that this was a belief about him or these were stories about them that evolved later. A guy by the name of, and I did some research on this, prepare for this, A.N. Sherwin-White. He's one of the greatest ancient historians in the world. He was a professor at Oxford University in England. And he did a study into the rate that legend has accrued in the ancient world. So basically he said, how long does it take, like a legend about a person, maybe there was a real King Arthur. How long did it take for the legend to become legend? And his conclusion was, it takes at least 2 generations for legend or mythology to grow up and to wipe out the solid core of historical fact. Part of it is you've got to get past the people who are eyewitnesses and the people who knew the eyewitnesses. So that's at least 2 generations. And there was when you look at the evidence about Jesus, there was nowhere near that kind of time for the beliefs about Jesus to evolve. The historical evidence that we have date to within 24 to 36 months after Jesus was crucified. And people were so convinced. We're actually going to talk about this on Easter. So I'm kind of giving us a little bit of a spoiler there, but it's a good spoiler. They were so convinced that Jesus had died and was now alive that they were willing to die for it. But what's interesting is when you look at the evidence, they were not convinced at first. Something happened that changed them. And then you have all these historical events. You have the day of Pentecost. Peter stands in a crowd of thousands of people, and he said, Jesus has been raised from the dead, and he says, to which we were all witnesses. And what did the audience do? Did they throw him out? Did they pick up stones to reject him? No. The history says 3,000 people on that day said, you're right. Now, what do we do with this? If it was a made-up fact, it wouldn't have caused that kind of overwhelming response. And then you look at all these historical evidence, the eyewitnesses. Matthew was the disciple, Peter was the disciple, John. We've talked about all those along the way. So we really, really can't conclude that his divinity was a myth. I don't think. Is there a certain amount of faith? Absolutely. Yeah. And we've talked about this before. That's intentional on God's part. Even a few weeks ago when we talked about
frustrating.
Yeah, it is. But, and go back and listen to the message. I think is the second message in the Heart of the Story series, in the story series that we're in right now, where we talk about the kingdom and what the kingdom means, and we talk about why feeling the presence of God, why sometimes often God doesn't allow us to feel his presence, because presence matters. And he wants us to learn to trust him without the overwhelming sense of his presence. And there's an illustration I use there that just helps it make sense.
So the last thing, I think, would then just be, how do we know he's the Messiah? How do we know?
And again, there's a certain amount of faith, right?
For sure. Yeah. But particularly the Messiah that's prophesied in the Old Testament, what are some of the connections there?
Well, and I think for us, so I'll quote the great theologian who wasn't a theologian, a fictional character, Sherlock Holmes.
One of our favorite theologians, for sure.
But Sir Arthur Conan Doyle is the author.
Doyle, right? Arthur Conan Doyle?
Conan Doyle? I don't know.
It's Conan Doyle.
The
guy who wrote
Sherlock Holmes. We'll just put it that way. Yeah. He says, and this was a quote from Sherlock, "Remove all things that cannot be true, and whatever remains, no matter how improbable or unlikely, must be the truth." And it's just logic as you look at it. And there's so many convincing proofs. We're going to talk on Easter about the resurrection. But the Bible says, if Jesus has not been raised, your faith is futile and you are still in your sins. Lee Strobel, who is an apologist, and what apologist means is someone who basically walks through proofs for our faith. He just wrote an incredible book, one of the best scholarly studies in the contemporary world on the reality of Jesus the Messiah. And I had the opportunity several years ago, Kylie and I had the opportunity to take Lee and his wife Leslie out to lunch and sit down with him. And he started talking about this book that it just flat out proves the resurrection. And by the time we were done with lunch, I'm like, I'll never doubt again. Because the evidence is just so strong. Now, I know because we're 2,000 years removed, there's still a little bit of, but, what is that? But when you look at this, and he made one statement. He said, for almost 2,000 years, cynics and scoffers have wondered what to do with all of the evidence for Jesus' resurrection. He said there's just so much there that they don't know what to do with it. And there's this headache-producing problem called the empty tomb that they can't get past because there's no reasonable explanation that makes any sense. Every reasonable explanation that they try to use, the evidence points the other way, like his body being stolen, or disciples hiding the body. When you examine the evidence for that, to get past the Roman soldiers whose lives would have been on the line if all that happened, and work through that, it makes no sense. Actually, the most reasonable explanation, even though it's miraculous, is that he actually did what he said he would do as you look through it. And then the big thing for me has always been fulfilled prophecy. And we've talked about this before, and again, 1 Corinthians 15, it says, "For what I received, I pass on to you of first importance, that Christ died for our sins, according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day, according to the Scriptures." And there have been, I would encourage you, if you haven't, I could talk about it, but Google mathematician Peter Stoner. Well, that's a horrible last name.
It's a rough one. Yeah, that was a rough one in middle school, I think.
Yeah. But he's a mathematician, and he calculated the odds of any person in human history fulfilling prophecies that they had no control over. And he calculated in several different ways and then tried to illustrate it. We've used some of his illustrations, like silver dollars filling up the state of Texas. And he talks about one of how many atoms, it would take like a universe, and you'd have to pick one atom out of several universes full of atoms, and that's the odds of this. He said, you just look at the mathematical probability, and you go, this has to be God. This has to be God. And so, again, when we look at this, there's always an element of faith, but the reality of it is the evidence for Christianity is so strong that for me, it takes less faith for me to believe in Jesus than for me to say he's not who he claimed to be. I can't say he's an ordinary man. I can't say he was just a good man, a good teacher. He did not allow us to in what he claimed, and his life did not allow us to. So the best conclusion for me is he is who he claimed to be.
Can I ask, it's
Sure.
on topic, but it wasn't something we planned or anything. But so a lot of times the evidence that comes up is, okay, so these people that followed him and then chose to believe in him and then chose to die, the disciple,
right.
We don't have, it's not like it's in the Scriptures or anything, but there's, according to church tradition, at least
some
10
of
of the 11.
Some of it's historically documented.
Some of it is. 10 of the 11 remaining disciples died horrifically. Yep. John's the only one who didn't, and he was banished to some terrible island.
And punished in horrible ways before he did,
Yeah, he only got there because he survived other things. And And so people will say, well, they wouldn't have done that, if it wasn't true. But we do have examples of, they're like cult leaders that get people to follow them and give their lives for them. And that's something that people have said to me before too. They're like, well, he was just a cult leader who, who was really good at it and got people to follow him. And we have examples of that just in the last, 50 years here in the United States. You can pull up different examples. What would you say to somebody in that?
I think, yes, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. There are cult leaders who are incredibly charismatic and who dupe people into that, and people believe in them. Most of the time, they believe in them while they're still alive, and they sacrifice themselves while they're still alive. Once that person dies and what they claim and who they claim to be is proven to be false, people walk away. What's interesting is, this group of people followed Jesus while he was still alive, but even while he was still alive, they weren't willing to give their lives for him.
Yeah.
When he was arrested, every one of them left him. Every one of them left him. And when you look at like Peter, so Peter didn't believe, then he believed, then he denied he believed, then he re-believed, Yeah. And even when he went to the empty tomb, he didn't believe right away. So what changed? Something changed, and the answer is the resurrection. And then you've got to deal with James, the half-brother of Jesus, who, it's clear in Scripture that he didn't believe his brother was God. And after the resurrection, and you can read it in his own words in the book of James, he moves well beyond, he's my brother. No, he is my Lord and my God. For a brother to say that about their brother, something happened, Yeah,
what a miserable circumstance to be the brother of Jesus. What a letdown to your parents you are.
Yeah, it's like, whoa, what is that? But
sure.
So, I think the big thing is for me that it's not the entirety of the answer. Let's just be honest with it. It's not the entirety of the answer. But a big thing for me with that is the Bible is incredibly honest. And most writings, in fact, I would say all writings from cults are not incredibly honest. The Bible is incredibly honest about their doubts and their fears. And then something changed. Where when you track the trajectory of any cult, it's you better not believe it. A lack of belief is always shamed and always guilted. It's not tolerated. Name a cult where that's not true. And doubt and questions and fear were never shamed and never just even sort of tolerated by Jesus. There were times he's like, oh, come on, but, and even, okay, let's just look at the story of Peter. He told Peter that he would deny him. And after he comes back from the dead, he meets Peter on the shore and serves him breakfast. And Peter is feeling shamed and guilty. And Jesus does what? He says, Peter, you need to know I love you. And he tells him 3 times, you need to know I love you. Now, feed my sheep. And it was all about the mission in that moment. So, if I'm writing, if I'm making up a religion, I'm not going to be that honest.
Sure. Yeah.
And that's part of what helps me with that. I don't think there's any other cult or false religion that you can point to that is as honest about who we are and our struggles and gives us as much grace as Christianity. That's another reason why I would say, this is the God I want to follow.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Pastor Mike. Thanks to all of you for joining us for episode 91. If you haven't subscribed yet, make sure that you do that. And especially on your phone, make sure you have notifications turned on so you get notified when the new episodes go live. But we do one of these every single week. Excuse me. We do one of these every single week. The Pastor Mike kind of dives a little bit deeper into his teaching from the weekend. So hopefully you're joining us at one of our gatherings on the weekends and then getting on YouTube or Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and just diving a little bit deeper with us each week. The kind of next step, homework, whatever we've been calling it for this whole series has been keep reading with us. Yep. So whether you got the storybook that we've been going through, which again is just the Bible, just put chronologically, which by the way, I haven't been reading in the story. I've been following the reading plan in my Bible, but there's a lot of people, myself included, that are loving reading it chronologically. And I think you were even mentioning this week, like people have been saying to you, I've never really tied these things together or, studied them that way. And myself included, it's just been a really, really cool thing to go all the way through it like this. And we're nearing the end, which is close. Wild.
Yeah.
So make sure you've been joining us. If you missed anything, always go back and catch up with it. We'll be back next week. Until then, we'll see you later.